Some of these meals quietly disappeared. Others, people try not to remember. But in 1960s Britain, this was completely normal. The 1960s were a time of change. But when it came to food, Britain was still holding on to habits from an earlier era. Meals were simple, ingredients were limited, and creativity often meant making the most of very little. Here are 10 forgotten meals from 1960s Britain that look completely unbelievable today. 1. Spam fritters. Spam wasn't just food in the 1960s, it was everywhere. A small rectangular tin, opened with a key that peeled back the metal lid. Inside was that solid block of pink meat. Dense, smooth, slightly glossy. On its own, it was already a staple. But when it became a fritter, it turned into something else entirely. A slice would be cut, dipped into batter, and dropped into hot oil. The sound of it frying, loud, constant. Within minutes, it came out golden, crispy on the outside, soft and salty on the inside, usually served with chips, or sometimes just on its own with a bit of bread. It was cheap, filling, and easy to make in large quantities. School canteens served it, homes relied on it, and for many families, it wasn't occasional. It was regular. Looking back now, it feels like a strange combination, but at the time, it made perfect sense. 2. Liver and onions. This was one of those meals you could smell before you saw. It started in a frying pan, slices of liver, thin, dark, slightly uneven, cooked with onions that slowly softened, releasing that strong, unmistakable smell. Then came the gravy, thick, dark, poured over everything, served with mashed potatoes, sometimes peas on the side. For some people, it was comfort food, rich, hearty, filling. For others, it was something to endure. The texture was firm, slightly grainy. The flavor was intense. There wasn't really a middle ground. You either liked it or you really didn't. But either way, it appeared regularly. Because in the 1960s, nothing was wasted. And liver was both affordable and available. 3. Corned beef hash. This was a meal built entirely around practicality. A tin of corned beef, potatoes usually left over or boiled fresh, sometimes onions if they were available. Everything went into one pan. The corned beef broke apart as it heated, mixing with the potatoes, turning into a soft, slightly sticky texture. The edges would crisp slightly if left long enough, adding just a bit of contrast. It wasn't carefully presented, it wasn't styled, it was simply served straight from the pan. Hot, filling, reliable. For many households, this was the kind of meal that appeared at the end of the week, when ingredients were running low, when you had to make something out of what was left, and somehow it always worked. 4. Egg and chips. Few meals were as simple or as dependable. Eggs in a frying pan, the oil gently bubbling around the edges, the whites slowly setting while the yolk stayed soft. At the same time, chips cooked alongside. Golden, crisp on the outside, soft in the middle. Everything was placed on a plate, often without much thought for presentation. No garnish, no decoration, just food. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't new, but it didn't need to be. It was affordable, quick to make, and universally understood. Sometimes that was enough. 5. Jelly and evaporated milk. Dessert in the 1960s didn't try to impress, it tried to work. Jelly came in bright colors, red, orange, green, made by dissolving cubes in hot water, then left to set in a bowl. Hours later, it was ready, firm but still wobbling slightly, cut into squares or scooped into portions. Then came the evaporated milk. Pale, slightly thick, poured over the top. It didn't quite soak in, it sat on the surface, creating a contrast in both color and texture. Cold jelly. Cool, slightly creamy milk. It looked unusual, even slightly artificial, but for many people, it was a regular dessert. Predictable, simple, and always there at the end of a meal. 6. Fish paste sandwiches. Lunch in the 1960s wasn't about variety. It was about what was available, what lasted, and what could be prepared quickly. And few things captured that better than fish paste. Small glass jars lined up neatly on kitchen shelves, each with a simple label: salmon, shrimp, anchovy. Twist the lid open, and inside was that unmistakable texture. Smooth, thick, slightly glossy, not quite solid, not quite spreadable without effort. It had to be worked into the bread. Pressed in with a knife, dragged across the surface in slow strokes, usually onto soft white bread, the kind that compressed slightly under pressure. No crunch, no contrast, just soft bread and a strong, salty filling. Sometimes butter went on first, sometimes not. It depended on the household. Then the sandwich was closed, pressed together, and often wrapped in paper for later. Taken to school, carried in a small lunchbox. By the time it was eaten, it had settled. The bread slightly firmer, the flavor slightly stronger. There was no mistaking it. You always knew what it was the moment you took a bite. And while it might not sound appealing now, at the time it was completely normal, reliable, expected. Just another part of the day. 7. Shepherd's pie, the original version. Shepherd's pie in the 1960s wasn't about presentation. It wasn't carefully layered, it wasn't styled. It was built. Practical, filling, efficient. Minced meat would be cooked first, usually in a large pan, with onions if they were available. The smell filled the kitchen slowly, warm, savory, familiar. Then came the gravy, simple, thick, poured in and stirred through. Nothing fancy, just enough to bring everything together. That mixture would be spread into a dish, not evenly, just enough to cover the base. Then came the mashed potato. Spoonfuls dropped on top, spread out with the back of a fork, sometimes smooth, sometimes uneven, often with lines dragged across the surface, not for decoration, just from the motion of spreading it. Then into the oven, slowly heating through, the top beginning to change, edges drying slightly, the surface turning golden in patches, not perfectly browned, not consistent, but enough to create that thin layer on top. When it came out, it wasn't sliced neatly. It was scooped, large portions lifted onto plates, steam rising immediately. It was hot, heavy, deeply filling. This was food designed to last, to feed multiple people, to stretch across more than one meal. And for many families, it wasn't occasional. It was a regular part of life. 8. Blancmange. Blancmange was one of those desserts that felt slightly unfamiliar, even at the time. It didn't look like anything else. And it didn't quite feel like anything else either. It started as a powder, usually in a small packet, mixed carefully with milk in a saucepan, heated slowly, stirred constantly, because if you stopped, it would catch. And once it caught, the texture changed completely. So you stood there, stirring, watching it thicken, gradually transforming from liquid into something heavier, smoother. Then it was poured into a mold, sometimes decorative, sometimes just a simple bowl, and left to set. When it was ready, it held its shape, turned out onto a plate, standing on its own, smooth surface, pale color, almost too perfect, sometimes slightly shiny under the light. The texture was what made it memorable. Soft but not loose, firm but not solid. It moved slightly when touched, not quite like jelly, not quite like custard, somewhere in between. Flavor was subtle, vanilla, sometimes almond. Nothing overpowering. It didn't need to be. Blancmange wasn't about bold flavor. It was about consistency, predictability, and for many households it appeared often enough that it became part of the routine. 9. Stewed fruit with custard. Fruit in the 1960s wasn't always eaten fresh. Often it was transformed, cooked down slowly, until it became something softer, something warmer. Apples were the most common, peeled carefully, cored, cut into uneven pieces, then placed into a pot with a bit of water, sometimes sugar, sometimes not, then left to simmer. At first the pieces held their shape, but gradually they softened, edges breaking down, until the entire mixture became thick, almost collapsing into itself. Rhubarb worked the same way, but sharper, more tart, breaking down faster, turning into that distinctive pink color. Once ready, it was spooned into bowls, still hot, still steaming. Then came the custard, poured over the top, warm, smooth, flowing into the gaps, mixing slightly with the fruit underneath. The contrast was immediate. Sweet custard, slightly sharp fruit, soft texture throughout. Nothing crisp, nothing firm, just warmth, comfort. It was the kind of dessert that didn't stand out, but it stayed with you because it was always there. After dinner, on colder evenings, part of the routine. 10. Bread and dripping. This was perhaps the simplest of all, and also the one that feels the most surprising now. After cooking meat, usually beef, something was always left behind. The fat, collected from the pan, poured carefully into a container, left to cool. As it cooled, it changed, from liquid to solid, forming a thick, spreadable layer. This was dripping. Nothing added, nothing altered, just what remained. Bread would be sliced, often fresh, still soft, sometimes still slightly warm. Then the dripping was spread on top, pressed in with a knife, melting slightly as it touched the surface. Sometimes uneven, sometimes thick in places. A bit of salt might be added, sometimes not. Then eaten immediately. No cooking, no preparation beyond that. The flavor was rich, deep, almost heavy. It coated the mouth, lingering after each bite, and while it might seem unusual now, at the time it wasn't. It was practical, it was efficient. It meant nothing was wasted. Every part of the meal had a purpose, and this was simply the final step. These meals weren't designed to impress. They were built around what was available, what was affordable, and what could feed a family. Some of them have disappeared completely. Others have quietly changed over time. But all of them tell a story about how people lived. Simple, practical, uncomplicated. Which of these have you actually tried? And which one would you never even consider? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring Britain's past, subscribe for more.